If your job can be replaced by an AI subscription service right now, are you providing value commensurate with the standard of living that you have? That hurts our spending power. We will feel some pain from that, but not the pain of like Mad Max situation. The dollar's not going away. I don't think the dollar's going to not be the reserve currency. I just think that our spending power is not going to be enough to acquire the same standard of living for the same work that we're doing. Every door is closed except one. One tool, one outcome. The Fed and the Treasury will be forced to... All right, welcome back to Remnant Finance, another solo episode here. Brian is out over in the Middle East, just spraying democracy over there. They're loving it. They can't get enough. They want it. They really want to. They see what we have here, and they just want that. You know, they hate us because they ain't us, as we're told. Yeah, that's hard to say with a straight face, but he's over there. So we are rolling solo here again today. Hopefully, we get a resolution of this disastrous, pointless war soon. Hopefully, Trump waves a white flag, calls it a political victory. You know, gets the headline PR, and we get out of there before we do something really stupid like a ground invasion that we would absolutely get whooped on. Very frustrating to see how exposed we are letting ourselves be here, particularly being of a Navy background. Kind of the control of the sea lanes is the premise of the empire, and we've just ceded that ground. We've shown that we cannot control the sea lanes. And so anyways, I think that we need to keep our finger on the pulse of the macroeconomy. So much is changing. We need to continuously learn their playbook. We also need to learn the new playbook that we're trying to implement as far as severing our dependence on them. Because what's going to happen is going to happen. Are we going to, cut the bleeding and call it a loss and come home, and then they open back up the straits? And I don't know. Or are we going to keep digging this hole for ourselves? But regardless, a lot seems to be unraveling before our eyes economically, and so. In that vein, I want to go back to a I'm going to go back to a macroeconomic concept. About a year ago, I did a series of solo episodes called Know Your Enemy, maybe 4 or 5 episodes walking through some of the central bank playbook, because I think there's a lot on our side of the fence as far as recognizing that we've been duped. And, you read The Creature from Jekyll Island, you know that the Federal Reserve is this kind of fraudulent institution. You don't like the idea of central banking, so you say in the Fed. But so many people that I've talked to that would say in the Fed, if you ask them, don't understand what the Fed does. They don't actually understand money mechanics and how they work in a central bank economy. And so what I want to cover today is the yield curve control measures that might be coming, as well as just the national debt. I made a point in a previous episode, who are we in debt to? You might wonder, we have coming up on a $40 trillion national debt. Well, every other country is in debt to every other country. So who are we in debt to? Well, we are in debt to the holders of U.S. Treasury, which includes investors like us. You can go onto iGov and buy 10-year Treasury bonds right now, and the bond will be paid, the coupon will be paid, and then the face amount will be returned at the duration of the bond that you purchase. Other countries buy these debts. Investors buy the debts. Foreign central banks buy the debts. You always hear about the reserve holdings. The dollar is the reserve currency. That means that central banks around the world buy treasuries because it is a liquid asset, because every other country agrees that they will take that. And so there's a lot of economic fear porn right now about countries dumping treasuries and, the dollar's coming to an end. I don't believe that. Companies dump and buy treasuries in a cyclical manner. They do it to balance their sheets. As rates change, as their obligations change, they're selling them to other countries. They're buying them. They're having their bonds, in the same way that our treasury is having to renew bonds. Like as bonds expire, they're purchasing new ones, et cetera. So it's whenever central banks around the world start selling treasuries, there's headlines, kind of screeching about the end of the dollar, and it coincides with the first time in the last 30 years where central bank gold holdings outnumber central bond treasury holdings, according to a latest report. And so there's a lot of kind of fear out there. I don't think the dollar system is so deep and so liquid, and as long as the government continues to pay the bond holders, even though they are borrowing and stealing from the future, and that's what we want to cover today, kind of the mechanics of how this system works. So long as that's the case, and I believe personally, if I'm putting my money on it, I'm betting on the fact that that system is going to continue for a long time. Um, there's no viable replacements right now. There's no solution that's proposed that is going to replace treasuries as the primary reserve currency throughout the world. Now, there might be a lesser dependence on them, which would hurt us, as far as our ability to provide less value than what we're compensated for, right? We're not putting out commensurate value with how we are compensated because we are at the front of the line for dollars. They call it the Cantillon effect. And when we talk about it here in America, we say the Federal Reserve prints money. That money goes first to the primary dealers, those banks that have a window at the Fed. They invest it, they put it out into their investments. Eventually, it trickles down through the bank system, and then it gets to us. And by the time it gets to us, the asset purchases made at the primary dealer level, and below that, in the hedge funds and Wall Street, there's all these people that get to interact with this money, get to put it out into the economy and acquire investments, so that as that money flows down, by the time you or I ever see it, so many assets have been purchased with it, and that we get this diminished purchasing power. It's the Cantillon effect, roughly. But that also happens at a global scale too, and we are the front of the line. You and me are at the front of the global line for that, in the sense that it's not hard for someone to get a car here, right? Everyone can buy a car. I say everyone, but like you know what I mean. Like we are all used to our entire lives just having a car. It's just something you do. We can go to the dealership and get a brand new car if you want to finance it. If you want your monthly payment, all you have to do is show you can make the $800 or the $1,200 a month, and you can get a brand new car. Well, your job likely is not commensurate with that amount of value on a large scale. A lot of jobs are going away, as we can we talk about AI. So it's like, if your job can be replaced by an AI subscription service right now, are you providing value commensurate with the standard of living that you have? For a lot of people, I don't think so, and I think that that's going to play out more and more. But when countries dump treasuries, when they're selling treasuries, well, a lot of it is just the ebbs and flows of their balance sheets. A lot of it is just macroeconomic rebalancing, and it's not an indication that something's wrong with the dollar. Now, I think something is wrong with the dollar, but that in and of itself is not the fear-inducing headline that it's made out to be. Because there's never the corresponding headline, oh, countries are scooping up treasuries, when the inevitable rebound occurs. It's just the ebbs and flows. But we want to talk through who's buying these treasuries, and what does it mean for them to hold them? Why are they holding them? And what happens if there is a large scale effort to not purchase treasuries, or if there's just a shift in the macroeconomic environment where countries aren't buying as many treasuries? Well, that hurts us. That hurts our spending power as us being at the front of the Cantillon effect, globally speaking. We feel like we're at the bottom of it in America, but America, in a long line of dollars or $4 around the world at the dollar window, we get first dibs, right? And so I think we will feel some pain from that, but not the pain of like Mad Max situation. I don't. The dollar's not going away. I don't think the dollar's going to not be the reserve currency. I'm not worried about the dollar being replaced by something. I just think that our spending power is not going to be enough to acquire the same standard of living for the same work that we're doing. The value of our work is currently decreasing as far as actual value that we are providing to the world, because we're doing so more expensive than someone else who can do it. Like, we paid someone to develop our website a couple years ago, and it was okay, but we've done a full overhaul in the last couple weeks, and it looks so much better, right? And we paid a fraction of what we paid the person to initially design it. Well, we'd be crazy to way overpay somebody to do a job that we can get done better using tools that we have at our disposal. Like, it just makes sense. And so there's a lot of jobs like that where you're no longer providing the value. AI is a huge part of that, but in general, before AI, like, even if you eliminate AI from the conversation, you working at the HR department of Target or something does not actually provide value into the economy, right? And no offense if that's your position, but honestly, like, to have a middle class suburban, like having a home, like a nice home that you can get on a mortgage, having a paid off car or a nice car that you have payments on, like, this standard of living is not earned if we actually had to measure the amount of value we provide to the world. We kind of have a fake, over financialized economy where we derive all of this value. So that's where I think it could hurt. But I'm not a doomsday, it's all falling apart kind of mentality personally. Okay, but let's talk about. I want, when you see all these headlines about treasuries, I want you to know what treasuries are. I want you to know what it means when, when we're talking about the surplus, about the, or sorry, not the surplus, the deficit that we have. And so our national debt is financed. We're borrowing it from the future, right? We're going into further debt to pay off our not just our bills, but also the interest on the debt. And then on top of the interest on the debt that we have, when those bills expire, they need to be replaced by new bills. So what I want to do is I want to read through some of a piece by James Lavish, who runs, or he's a former Wall Street guy, but he has a newsletter called The Informationist, and it is a phenomenal, very easy to read walkthrough of these different concepts, and you get once a week. I'm going to read through an article that talks about this spiral of what's happening with the debt. So I'm going to kind of jump around here a little bit because I recommend paying for a subscription to this. It's that valuable. I don't want to just read the whole thing outright, but effectively it's talking about how over the course of the last month, expectations of what the Fed's going to do have changed drastically from what you would have thought or what the market had priced in. It kind of looked like, okay, things are ready for a rate cut, right? But now they're back in between a rock and a hard place with everything. All the wrenches being thrown at the Fed right now and at the Treasury as far as the uncertainty with the war, the Straits of Hormuz, et cetera. They are now pricing in possible rate increases because they're so stuck between, like, both of their mandates at the Fed, currency stability and employment. They're each pulling them in different directions. They're each making a case for doing the opposite thing, but they have to prioritize one over the other. And so it looks like they may be holding rates steady or possibly even raising rates. They just can't cut rates right now. And so the bond market is pricing as if they think the rates will actually hike. So that he says, if you're the Treasury Secretary reading these headlines, seeing these developments, you feel sick. To understand why, we need to go back a few years, because this crisis didn't start last week. It started with a decision, an astonishingly poor one, by none other than former U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. So this decision he's talking about, and what would make a Treasury Secretary sick right now, is so much of the assumptions that went into policy decisions over the last 5 years were based on the assumptions that rates are going to go back down and this will become manageable. Of course, we got, going into this administration, we were given the impression that they would be cutting spending like DOGE, like slashing the DOD budget, right? We could cut the military budget in half, is what Trump had said. Now they're trying to get a 50% increase. Now they asked for $1 trillion budget. Now they're trying to get $1.5 trillion. And so the spending has gone off the charts. Every president has been, in a row has been off the charts spending from the last one. But we really got the impression of this second Trump administration that the spending would actually be reined in. And in fact, it has exploded much further. This makes Joe Biden, if it wasn't for the fact that he's just, like dementia-riddled retard shitting his pants who never made a decision in his entire presidency, it makes him look as if he was actually wisely stewarding resources for the economy. Of course, no such thing was happening, but the spending that's happening right now is just obliterating what happened under Trump. And so that assumption that spending would be reined in, that maybe we could balance the budget, and Howard Lutnick's ideas about monetizing the gold, like all of this stuff made it seem like, okay, well, rates are going to come down, so we'll make decisions based off that. But if we go back to 2021, Janet Yellen had the opportunity, a once-in-a-generation window, as James Lavish says, to term out the debt. And so the rates were so low back then, 1%, like free money effectively. So what they needed to do was they needed to sell very long-dated treasuries, 30-year treasuries. If you can sell 30-year treasuries that pay out 1%, you're spreading out that cost over so long, and you're giving yourself such a long runway ahead to fix this problem. And instead, what Yellen did was a record number of short-term treasuries, 1, 2, 5-year treasuries that are now coming due now and over the next couple of years. And rates have gone up. Jerome Powell stopped playing ball with forcing rates down. And I think that was the right decision economically, personally, even though it's going to hurt. I don't think the idea that we need to lower rates just to make the economy feel better, just to make people's asset values feel better, is the right move in the long term. But Powell held rates steady and then even raised them. And so now Yellen could have pushed this. I mean, it's still kicking the can. This whole system is by definition kicking the can. So we can't escape the fact that if we're funding the debt or monetizing the debt, i.e., we're having to create more debt in order to pay the interest, we could at least kick that can 30 years down the road very cheaply, and that would have been that was a phenomenal opportunity to get a grip on this coming tidal wave. It would be like you could mitigate some of the damage by doing that. So he says, when Yellen became Treasury Secretary in 2021, she helped facilitate trillions of dollars being printed during COVID. Stimulus checks, PPP loans, direct payments. The printing press was running full speed. She also had something no Treasury Secretary is likely to see again: interest rates at historic lows. The 10-year was yielding barely 1%. The 30-year at 1.8%. I mean, imagine, having, like, of course we know that like those rates are not directly reflective of what the mortgage rates are, but that's why I have people with 2.5% mortgages. And you tell them like they would never refinance that, right? If you have a 2.5% mortgage, that's why people aren't moving. Because if you have to refinance that into a new rate, your debt amount might stay the same, but your monthly payment goes off the charts, right? So in the same way, she could have locked in 30-year mortgages of, quote, not actual mortgages, but that's an easier term for us to think about. Imagine like locking in 30-year mortgages at 1.8%. Well, now that would look like a huge win, right? They're saving money in a very aggressive fashion that way. Saving's not the right word, but kind of is compared to what the situation is right now. Should a once in a generation window to term out the debt. Translated, issue longer dated debt like 7, 10, or even 30 years and lock in those rates for decades. She didn't do it. Instead, she kept borrowing short. Bills and notes that mature in months, not decades. Instruments that roll over constantly, and here's the key, they refinance at whatever rate the market happens to be charging at that moment. When rates are falling, it works fine. You keep getting cheaper deals. When rates are rising, it's a disaster. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is she supposed to know? How could anyone have predicted rates would go up as much? She should have somehow, should she have somehow anticipated this? The answer is yes. Yellen had been the chair of the Federal Reserve. She sat in that seat and understood better than almost anyone alive what that kind of money creation does to inflation. She knew the risks. She saw them coming, and she ignored them, leaving the problem for the next Treasury Secretary to deal with. Enter Scott Bessent. He took the job in January 25. He publicly voiced similar concerns about Yellen, but he also believed rates would come back down and that he could gradually shift towards longer maturities and stabilize things. If you kind of think of like where you are at the current rates, every if you're a bond investor, if you're the one who purchased the Treasury and rates are way lower right now, well, you have an asset that's appreciated in value because you're getting paid a much higher rate than the market. If you're getting paid 5% on a bond and the going market rate is 2.5%, you're getting paid 100% more than the market rate right now. So you have that at a premium. That's a good thing if you're an investor. Conversely, the other side of that is the people that want to be, the people that want to have the lower cost is the people that actually issue the debt and pay out the interest, and that is the Treasury. Right? So they want lower rates, and the market wants higher rates. And somewhere in the middle is where they meet when people actually buy it. You got to find a place that people will buy it. So everybody believed, including Bessent, that the rates were going to come down, but then Powell stopped cutting. Iran happened, oil spiked, and inflation expectations reversed. He said, to be honest, I'd be surprised if he doesn't just quit at this point, but let's assume he doesn't. How can he remedy it? How bad is it? And where does that leave us? The U.S. national debt just crossed $39 trillion. You've seen that number. But today we're not talking about the total. We're talking about what's coming due. Remember, Yellen kept borrowing short. A huge chunk of that debt matures every single year. It doesn't sit there quietly for decades, as it would have had she put this debt out 30 years at 1.8%. It comes due in very short order, and the Treasury has to refinance it. So this year, if you look at this article, you can see he's got a graph here that goes out over the next 30 years, and it's 10x in the next year, and then the year after that, 2027, is half of that, and then lower, 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 and it's this long tail. So it's basically like an enormous amount of debt is coming due this year, an absurd amount. Like the next 3 years combined, it's that high. What's coming due in this coming year? So this year, that number is just shy of $10 trillion. That's 1/3 of all outstanding marketable debt rolling over this year in 2026. 1/3 of all the Treasury debt. And it gets worse. All of that debt was issued when rates were lower. The weighted average yield on those bonds is just 2.3%. Today, the Treasury is refinancing at 3.5% to 4.4%, depending on the maturity. And as we just saw from those charts, rates aren't going down. They may be going up. On $10 trillion, every 1 percentage point higher costs roughly $95 billion a year in additional interest. So just this year alone, what's already outstanding on the books, there's interest on that entire amount that's due. But there's also the fact that we need to, quote, roll over the debt. So $10 trillion worth of bonds are expiring this year. Well, let's jump over to, okay, well, what if we just didn't renew it, right? What if we just let them expire and we didn't issue at the current amount? Well, that's the problem when you're in deficit spending. So the debt was never meant to be repaid all at once. So the government's been borrowing for decades now. So money borrowed 30 years ago, it issues bonds with the maturity date, i.e., let's say that's this year, the bondholder is owed back the full principal. And so you have to have this giant pile of cash sitting here, $10 trillion, just to pay the principal back. It's not like you get to keep the principal and you just pay them the interest. You pay them the interest during the term at 1.8% or whatever it was 30 years ago. You paid them every year. And then at the expiration, you have to have a pile of cash to pay back the principal that they put up. So we owe investors. Who do we owe? We owe foreign governments who hold these treasuries in their central banks. We owe foreign investors who own these treasuries in their personal asset allocation. We owe Americans who have bought these. We owe anyone who's invested in treasuries. We owe them their principal back on the bond. That's $10 trillion right there. And so you say, okay, well, come up with the $10 trillion, give it to them, and right now, for the love of God, don't roll those loans over, right? Well, we can't do that because we are underwater in our spending. So if you don't have a giant pile of cash sitting around to pay those, because you spent that money a long time ago, they now have to borrow new money just to pay back the old bondholder. That is the rollover. So it's like refinancing your home, right? When you refinance your home, you might keep the same mortgage amount, the same total amount, but now it's at a new rate. So we don't have $10 trillion sitting in cash that we can pay off these bondholders and just walk away. We have to borrow $10 trillion at the new market rates, which means we have to sell those treasuries to investors at the current market rates. And so all we did was just kick that can further down the road. So those bills can't just fall off, because that would mean that we're actually paying down the debt, where we would reduce the total outstanding. But then to do that, we have to run a surplus, which means we have to collect more than we spend. And this doesn't happen, right? We cannot collect more than we spend because we are increasing the spending every year. And so there was such a desperate push by Trump to force Powell to lower the rates, because every like they said there, on $10 trillion, every 1% increase was about $100 billion in extra interest that we're going to have to pay. And so if we had an intention of actually reducing spending, like was promised, like Doge made it seem like that might happen, like the cuts to like what campaign Trump said was, we're going to cut the military budget because that's the largest expense outside of Social Security, Medicare, all these obligations that aren't going to go away, even though they should. They're not going to go away. And then you have defense, and defense is a budget that could be, if anyone's been in the military, you could trim half the military and you would have an improvement in efficiency. I mean, it's just the definition of like a rotting corpse of inefficiency. Now, there's a lot of efficiency at the operational level that's kind of like compressed into the tail end. But overall, as a whole, the military is very inefficient and mostly just like people collecting paychecks. I mean, it is just a buffet of welfare benefits for a large chunk, enough that you could certainly say, we could, last year, going into Trump's first year, we could have cut a lot of the military budget. But instead, we increased it from around $800 billion to $1 trillion. And now we're asking for $1.5 trillion for the next military budget. That's preposterous. And so we can't not only can we keep the spending static, we can't stop increasing the spending. Not only can we just take our foot off the gas and hit cruise control, we can't take our foot off the accelerator and keep going. And so there is no scenario right now. They don't have the cash, so they can't just pay those bondholders their principal back and then not reissue. So in order to pay those $10 trillion, they have to borrow $10 trillion, and those are done at current interest rates. So it's this cyclical continuing to kick the can down the road, and it makes sense if there was never actually an intent to cut spending, why the push was so frenzied to get Powell to lower rates. It makes sense. So go back to this article here. So they're refinancing at 3.5 to 4.4% today, depending on the maturity. For $10 trillion, every single percentage point costs about $95 billion additional interest. This alone would be a serious problem, but it's only the first piece. Because the government doesn't just refinance the bonds that are coming due. It also has to pay interest on every bond it has ever issued that's still outstanding. That's the full $39 trillion. So when I look at that chart that goes out to 2056, every single one of those bonds has to be paid interest. Now, the interest on those ones individually depends on what they were at when they were issued, but it says that the weighted average on this year's, so all the bonds that were issued, that expire in 2026, some of them were issued a year ago, some of them were issued 30 years ago, but that the weighted average on all that $10 trillion is 2.3%. So every single bond that's ever been issued that's still outstanding has to be paid interest. And the $10 trillion that's expiring this year has to be paid back. The principal has to be paid back. And so the interest on our bill, just on the Treasuries outstanding, is $1.2 trillion. It was $500 billion in 2020. It's $1.2 trillion 5 years later. The government is on pace for $2 trillion in annual deficits. It spends far more than it takes in. There's no reserve fund, no separate account to cover the interest. So how does it pay that $1.2 trillion? Now remember, $1.2 trillion, that is the interest on the current existing outstanding debt. How does it pay that $1.2 trillion? Well, it borrows it. What else can it do? Every single dollar of interest that's being paid on these is borrowed. So the government issues new debt to pay the interest on its old debt. Get that? New debt issued to pay the $1.2 trillion interest on the old debt. So we don't cut the $39 trillion outstanding. In fact, we add 1.2 to it this year, just in interest alone. And that all gets issued at today's rates, which are going up. The interest itself is being financed with more borrowing at higher rates, which creates more interest next year, which will also be borrowed at whatever rate the market is charging then. This is a cycle that feeds on itself, but we're not done stacking the fumbles yet. Because on top of the refinancing and the interest, there's the rest of the deficit. There's the gap between what the government collects in taxes and what it's spending on everything else, including the waste and the fraud and the new defense spending. I would argue those are all the same things. That was roughly $800 billion last year, but defense spending alone was $900 billion, with $1.5 trillion proposed for next year. People have been saying the defense budget is $1 billion now. I think he's rounding down. I think it's 900 something. I've been saying $1 billion in this podcast because that's people have been saying we went from 800 to $1 billion on the defense budget. But now, regardless of what it is now, maybe he's correct here. It's actually 900 billion. So if that's the case, then I misspoke calling it $1 billion. But regardless, they're proposing 1.5 trillion for next year. That's another 500 billion. And again, every single one of those dollars, because we're so deep in the red, we're borrowing the money to pay the 10 trillion that's expiring this year. We're borrowing that by issuing new debt. We're borrowing the 1.2 trillion that we need to pay the interest on the existing body of outstanding treasuries. And then our year over year spending, that's just new spending for the year, is 1.3 trillion. So let's add it all up. 10 trillion maturing in debt to refinance, 1.2 trillion in interest on the full debt, which is all borrowed, and $1.3 trillion in deficit spending beyond the interest. That's all new money that has to go out. So that's also borrowed. The United States needs to borrow $12 trillion this year, all of it at rising rates. Every 50 basis points higher, so half a percentage point, costs an additional $60 billion a year in interest, which also gets borrowed. Now here's where it turns into a loop. The borrowing pushes more treasury supply into the market. More supply puts upward pressure on yields, i.e., what those are paying. Higher yields means higher interest expense. Higher interest expense means more people borrow. More borrowing means more supplies, which pushes yields higher. And it's not just rate. The same geopolitical shock is feeding this loop from two directions at once. So, on the one side, inflation and rate shocks, we've got something like the Iran conflict. Oil prices spike, inflation increases, the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates elevated, right? That's contributing on one side to this loop. On the other side, the spending and the deficit shock. So we now have increased spending. So we have to borrow more money. We have to create more money to pay for the new money that is spent this year that we didn't have. Can anything stop it? Can the government stop spending enough, raise taxes enough, grow the economy fast enough to outrun it? Or does this loop lead somewhere specific, somewhere the Fed and Treasury have been before, but most investors haven't seen in their lifetimes? It does. And what it looks like is the key to understanding what comes next for your portfolio. Let's run through the options. We've done this many times before, but for those who are new around here, and here is James Lavish's Substack, The Informationist, we'll cover them quickly. Can the government cut spending? No. Defense is going up. Entitlements are untouchable. Can they raise taxes? Not near enough to cover a $2 trillion gap. Can they grow out of it? Not when your debt compounds at 3.5% and GDP grows at 2%. Can a recession help? It would only crush tax revenue and widen the deficit. Every door is closed except one. One tool, one outcome. The Fed and the Treasury will be forced to directly control the cost of borrowing, to step in and set a ceiling on interest rates and buy whatever bonds the market won't at that price. It's called yield curve control. I want to walk you through what this looks like in practice here in the United States with the tools the Fed has right now, because I believe some version of this is coming and I want you to recognize it when it arrives. You've heard of QE, quantitative easing, the Fed buying bonds to push rates lower. QE, quantitative easing, and yield curve control, YCC, sound similar. They both involve the Fed buying bonds, but there's a critical difference. QE is a volume decision. The Fed decides how much to buy. 50 billion a month, 100 billion, whatever the number the Fed picks, yields go where they go. So they're controlling the input. The output is whatever the yields are going to do. YCC, yield curve control, is a price decision. The Fed picks the output here. So they say, we're going to pick a yield and we're going to spend however much it takes to get there. So they're effectively buying these treasuries to keep the rates from going too high. 50 billion, 500 billion, 5 trillion, it doesn't matter. It's an open-ended commitment. The target is controlling the yield. The buying is unlimited. That's what makes it a fundamentally different regime. QE is a program you can taper. Yield curve control is a promise you can't easily take back. This is what it looks like. The Fed announces, this is James Lavish getting hypothetical here, what he thinks how this would look. So for example, the Fed announces a ceiling on the 10-year Treasury yield, somewhere around 3 to 4%. High enough to maintain some credibility, low enough to keep the debt serviceable and to keep mortgages and corporate borrowing from blowing up. Anytime the market pushes the 10-year above that ceiling, i.e. people needing more yield to buy these bonds so people aren't interested in buying them without a higher yield rate, the Fed steps in and buys with newly created money. The balance sheet expands, the dollar supply grows. This is called monetizing the debt. Every bond the Fed buys with printed dollars dilutes the purchasing power of every dollar you hold. The dollar weakens. Import prices rise. Inflation, which is already running hot, gets another tailwind by design. This is the mechanism. The whole point of yield curve control is to keep interest rates below the rate of inflation. That gap, negative real rates, is what slowly erodes the real value of the debt. It's how governments have always dealt with the debt this large, not by paying it off, but by inflating it away. We've done this before. In 1942, the Fed formally capped Treasury yields to finance World War II. Short rates were pegged at 0.38%, long capped at 2.5%. The policy lasted up to 1951. It worked. Debt to GDP went from 120% down to 30% over the following decades. The cost? Inflation approached 20%. Bondholders and savers were the ones who paid for it slowly through years of negative real returns, and wage earners got crushed. Today, we're back at 120% debt to GDP. With a $12 trillion borrowing need, and it's a doom loop that's accelerating. Now, this won't arrive as a press conference announcement. It never does. It comes in stages. And honestly, I believe some of the stages are already underway. Stage 1 is happening right now. The Fed is already buying $40 billion a month in Treasury bills. Buyback programs are expanding. The mechanisms of rate suppression are quietly being assembled. Step 2 comes next. The Fed starts using language that implies a comfort zone for the 10-year yield. We're monitoring long-term rates closely, forward guidance that amounts to an unspoken ceiling. The market begins to understand there's a line the Fed won't let yields cross. Step 3 is the trigger, a repo rate spike that threatens bank balance sheets, or the interest expense blowing past 1.5 trillion and accelerating the loop faster than anyone projected, or God forbid, a failed or near failed Treasury auction. To be clear, a failed Treasury auction is not on my bingo card, but yes, it can happen. And if it does, it forces the Fed's hand publicly. And then the final stage is formal yield curve control, a stated target with unlimited buying. Once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop because the moment you lift the cap, yields spike to wherever the free market says they should be. Given everything we just walked through, that could be catastrophic. Interest expense, bond prices, bank balance sheets, all of it breaks at once. Japan learned this the hard way. The Bank of Japan held yield curve control for 8 years. When they finally lifted the cap in 2024, the yen collapsed to 160 against the dollar, its weakest level since 1990. And once you're in, you're in. The only exit is to inflate the debt down to a manageable level, and that takes years. So if this is where we're heading, and I believe it is, what does it actually mean for your money? I said I wasn't going to read this whole article, but it's just so good. And I think it's so important to understand the mechanisms that they use, and us saying in the Fed. It doesn't matter if we say in the Fed. All we can do is separate from dependence on them. We're going to keep getting paid in dollars. We're going to keep needing dollars to transact. All we can do is understand how they're created, what the expected devaluation is going to do, and figure out a way where we can get that guaranteed compounding interest on our savings, which is what we talk about all the time when we're talking about infinite banking, when we're talking about whole life policies. How do we optimize our savings so that we can then leverage to grow and outpace inflation? We need to outprint the Fed. Cash and savings. Right now, cash is doing its job, earning 4% in the money market fund while you wait for clarity. Nothing wrong with that. But under yield curve control, rates get capped. Your money market yield drops. Your savings account pays less, and inflation stays elevated by design because the whole point is to keep rates below inflation. That gap between where your cash earns and what inflation takes is a slow bleed. You don't see a loss in your statement, but every month, every year, your purchasing power shrinks. This is the hidden tax. The government doesn't pay the debt with your tax dollars, it pays it with your purchasing power. Bonds. If you're holding long-term treasuries because you think rates are going to fall, you might get a short-term trade. Yield curve control push bond prices higher as the Fed buys aggressively. But as a long-term hold, you're locking in a yield that the government specifically designs to be below inflation. You're guaranteed to lose purchasing power for years. The 1940s bondholders learned this. They got their coupon payments, they got their principal back, and they lost a third of their real wealth over a decade. Gold and Bitcoin. Gold has been the go-to asset in every period of financial repression in modern history. When real rates go negative, when governments are actively devaluing their currency, gold reprices. If yield curve control arrives formally, I believe gold goes significantly higher from here. The same applies to Bitcoin with one addition, fixed supply, 21 million ever. In a world where the Fed is creating unlimited dollars to buy unlimited bonds, an asset with a hard cap becomes a release valve. Every time the Fed has expanded its balance sheet, Bitcoin has rallied. Yield curve control will be the largest sustained balance sheet expansion in history. I believe that acquiring gold and Bitcoin is a very necessary component to your asset allocation strategy. I've said before, I have a target for Bitcoin acquisition. I'm not in the camp of everything goes to Bitcoin. I don't believe in it dogmatically like that, but I do believe it's here to stay. It's going to continue to increase in value over the long term, and I have a target for how much I'm going to acquire by the end of the year. Same with gold. They are more important to me than stocks right now, even though stocks and options is where I'm really trying to outpace the Fed. It's balancing all of this. And again, we're not financial advisors. I want you to effectively, I want you to think, protect, save, grow, and actually apply that. So we're actually shoring up. And in this graphic that I'm working through for our new Tall Pine portal that'll be coming out hopefully in a month or so, your water effectively flows through a pipe, but it has options to be siphoned out if you don't have these exposures, these leak points, if you don't have them buttoned up. But once you do, you fill up that savings reservoir. And when that's full, then you go, and everything else beyond that goes and waters your garden of assets and growth. But the first step is making sure that nothing's leaking out on the protection side and that your savings reservoir is full. I believe that our whole life policies structured for infinite banking accomplish the protection and saving sides perfectly for what we're trying to do. And then from there, we grow and we outprint the Fed and we outpace inflation with our growth component there. But to cover the last few assets that he talks about and how this yield curve control would impact them, he's got stocks and real estate. Stocks tend to go up in nominal terms under yield curve control. Companies borrow cheaply and earnings inflate with prices, but real returns depend on pricing power. Real estate follows a similar pattern. Prices rise, but so does everything else. Both become inflation hedges for owners and affordability crises for everyone else. You don't have to predict the exact date yield curve control arrives. You just have to understand the direction. The loop is running. The math doesn't work at current rates. The alternatives have been exhausted. The only remaining tool prints money, caps rates, and inflates the debt away. That means you need to own hard assets, real things, scarce things, gold, Bitcoin, and quality equities with pricing power, things the government can't print into oblivion. And less exposure to the things that get quietly eaten, cash sitting idle, long-term bonds at fixed yields, anything denominated in dollars with no inflation adjustment. The Treasury's nightmare is real. The loop is accelerating, and the one outcome is coming. Now that you know what it looks like, you can position accordingly. So I think that there's no getting around the math of this tidal wave of debt that we're doing. Every year, if we're having to, one, print money in order to pay the principal back to the bonds that are expiring that year, two, print money to pay the interest on all the other bonds, and three, print money to fund deficit spending, which is only going to continue to increase, the amount of money has to continue to be created. And so I want for me, my dollars flow into my IBC system where they get locked in a vehicle that guarantees compound growth. It guarantees with a couple years in, I put $1 in, I generate more than $1 in my savings account. Long time from now, I'm generating $2 or $3 on every dollar that goes in. That's like 10 years from now. I'm going to keep doing that, and I want that to continue to grow. But at the same time, as it grows, as my savings grows and optimizes, I'm going to use that because I want to get dollars off of I want to get my capital off of the dollar conveyor belt. I have this continuous, I guess escalator is a better word. It's continuously going up the escalator in the form of guaranteed compound growth within my policy, earning dividends, right? If you understand the mechanics of a whole policy, that is an escalator that doesn't ever stop. But at the same time, I want to use that, and I want to get off of the escalator of dollars into hard assets. I want property. When we moved to New Hampshire, when I lock in a 30-year mortgage on the property that we're going to get there for our homestead, like that is locking in. I think the 30-year mortgage is one of the most powerful tools we have right now. And I'm not scared of the current rates because even though, yeah, it would have been nice to have a 2 or 3% rate from a couple of years ago, right now where rates could be going, I'm very comfortable locking in. If I were making this decision today, I'd be comfortable locking in a 6% mortgage, for instance. I'm not scared of that because this is going to happen. They're going to have to continue to print money to pay for the interest and to pay for the deficit spending. So if that's going to be the case, then it's going to be, if I lock in a monthly payment right now as far as the 30-year mortgage, then I'm locking in a depreciating value. Theoretically, I should have to work less to acquire the same amount of dollars to pay that monthly mortgage. Now, I don't apply that same logic when I'm talking about like buying a car. So like just finance a car, or credit card debt, something like that. And I don't view my primary home as an asset in the sense that it puts money into my pocket. It's not an investment to me. Your primary residence is not an investment, but it is the fact that you can lock in a 30-year fixed rate is a very valuable tool. And most countries don't have that. And so I think that understanding, and again, this all comes down to, we're in the game as with the rules that they give us. They give us rules to get out of it entirely if you want to just separate from full dependence on the dollar. But I don't want to do that. I want to optimize and have a life that my life requires dollars, and all the things that I want to do require dollars. So within that system, there's still ways to optimize, and that's what I think you should understand. When you hear the debates about the interest rate, should Powell cut, should he not cut, and then when the new secretary Warsh comes in, Trump. It seems like part of the job description to get that nomination. It seems like it's required that he's going to cut. But if he cuts, that's pouring more fuel on this fire. Even though on the same time it's decreasing the interest. It's decreasing the payments on the interest for the existing debt or for the new debt. I'm sorry. And so it's really stuck between a rock and a hard place for the Fed right now and for the Treasury. And what they're going to do, I don't really know. But I tell you, I feel very confident in the system that I have in place and the dry powder that I've got in place ready to go for when these things come on sale, because people that aren't prepared for this, people that don't understand it and just get kind of, thrown around by the tides. It's like things are going to go up, things are going to go down in the short term. You got to think about the long term. If you're getting tossed around by the tides here, you're losing your stability. And so having this rock, this foundational asset, for me is the most comfortable, best sleep you can have with what is going on with the market right now. We're trading options, so you're on, we're long and short on a lot of the same positions just due to the fact that things have been so unpredictable lately. And so there's value. There's a lot of, we're getting great cash flow from these strategies that we're putting in place. If you're a stock buyer, like Joe Withrow's Taylor portfolio has been performing phenomenally well. Like you continue to make money whether the market's going up or down. But at the end of the day, having that safe, stable foundation, I think, is invaluable right now. And having dry powder, it's not a bad place to be. So anyways, I know that got a little technical at the end there, but just understand what they're talking about when they're talking about, if you ever hear yield curve control, come back to this, look up this article and get yourself a primer on it, because that's when things can really get scary. But at the same time, all you can do is control what your family, make sure that you are in control of your family's journey here. Stop being a passenger in your financial future. And we will see you next time. I hope you understand a little bit more about interest rates and why we're in such a pickle. So, all right, y'all. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Remnant Finance. If you found any value at all in this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend.
Remember, true financial freedom comes from taking control of your personal economy and breaking free from the status quo. So stop being a passenger in your family's financial future.
Boldly take back control of your wealth. Until next time,
this is Brian and Hans signing off.